And I'm super excited to be here today to be with Danielle Teller, who is an author and a dear friend, and I'm going to share just a little bit about her. She grew up in Canada, where she was a bookworm and dreamed of being a writer, but she chickened out and went to medical school instead and attended Queen's University, as well as getting her medical training at McGill, Brown, and Yale. She's held faculty positions at the University of Pittsburgh and Harvard, where she investigated the origins of chronic lung disease and taught in the medical intensive care unit. Then in 2013, she quit her job to pursue that childhood dream of writing. She co-wrote Sacred Cows, The Truth of Divorce and Marriage with her husband, our own beloved Astro Teller. She has also been a regular writer for courts where, with wit as well as data, she writes about controversial yet accurate unseen truths hiding behind many of our long-held beliefs. And some of my favorite column titles include The Idiotic Argument Americans Use in Almost Every Political Debate, Let Mom Down from the Pedestal in Praise of the Messy, Imperfect, Authentic Mother, which was a Mother's Day writing, of course, Nearly All Our Medical Research is Wrong, How American Parenting is Killing the American Marriage. We're super excited to have Danielle here today, and we'll be discussing her book called All the Ever Afters. Before we start discussing with her, she's going to do a little reading for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm super impressed that people are taking time out of their busy work days to be here. I'm very touched, so thank you. So I'm going to read the prologue from the book, which I think really sets up what the book is about and gives you a flavor of the style of writing. And then I'll, in a couple sentences, just describe the arc of the book, and then we'll have a chat. Hopefully all of us will have a chat. Prologue. The Royal Court. Suppers at the Royal Court have become entirely too oppressive. It isn't just that they're interminable, or that we must adhere to the newest fashions, the face powder, our hair tortured into great bejeweled ram's horns, the silks with sleeves so tight that it's impossible to raise one's spoon to one's carefully tinctured lips. No, the worst is the gossip, the sinister buzz of wasps ready to slip their poisonous stingers into whatever tender flesh lies exposed. This evening, I was ordered to sit next to the Earl of Bristol, a pompous half-wit who has rarely been to court. He presides over some god-forsaken swamp in the north, and he seems to believe that his family's long history of loyalty to the crown gives him the right to opine on the behaviors of the royal family. "My lady," he said, plucking at cuffs so voluminous that they draped into his soup, "I understand that your noble daughters are not yet wed." "No, my lord," I answered as briefly as courtesy would allow. "And yet I've heard that they once vied for the attention of Prince Henry himself." The Earl dabbed his crimson lips daintily. "That they tried to alienate his affection from Princess Ephilda?" "You seem amused, my lord." He could not have mistaken the coldness in my response. "I fear that much of what you have heard is not true." "Ah, well, it is an incredible tale." He smiled broadly. "The beautiful downtrodden maiden who ascends to the royal palace, the jealous stepsisters, the glass slipper that would not fit." "My lord, I cannot credit such a tale." "Ah, come, my lady. You know that the whole kingdom is enthralled by our radiant and benevolent princess. I've heard a great deal about you and your daughters." He looked at me knowingly. "Compelling fiction often obscures the humble truth." "I do hope that you will tell me about the slipper," he said, ignoring my reluctance. He broke a piece of bread, leaving a trail of crumbs across the table. "My wife is frantic to know the particulars. They say that the prince let every maiden try the shoe, even your daughters." He laughed. "It is droll to imagine them receiving attention from a prince." "Well," his shrug was eloquent. "They are ugly, and Ephilda is beautiful." The Earl frowned and pursed his lips. It's genteel to imply nasty insults, not to speak them directly. My lord, I may have heard some of the rumors to which you allude. To my mind, these stories insinuate a plague of blindness. Prince Henry would have to be blind not to recognize the object of his admiration, or to distinguish an ugly girl from one of unsurpassed beauty. My daughters would need to be blind to their reflections in the mirrors and on the faces of those who behold them. My voice rose, so I paused and began again blandly. They would also need to be blind to the truth that men persuade themselves that beautiful women possess virtue and good character, whereas no amount of virtue can make an ugly woman beautiful. Ah, my lady, Princess Aphilda is a dazzling star who shines in the royal firmament, where she belongs. He did not attempt to conceal his disdain. That she invites you and your daughters to dine here at the palace is a testament to her compassion, forgiveness, and generosity. Indeed, my lord, I murmured. Indeed, that is so. I'm only of interest to the Earl of Bristol and his ilk because of my stepdaughter. Princess Aphilda is the most celebrated woman in the kingdom, perhaps in all of history. Commoners line the streets for endless hours, even in dark and sleet, hoping to glimpse her face through the window of her gilded carriage. When the princess has a gown cut in a new way or adopts a different hairstyle, every female creature in the city imitates her appearance. Last autumn, she wore a choker of pearls to church on Michaelmas, and the next day every noble woman's throat was wound snugly with pearls or other jewels. By Christmastide, even the peasant girls wore chokers of beads or ribbon, whatever material they could find to replicate the fashion. Princess Aphilda's popularity derives in large part from her astonishing beauty. But there's something else about her nature that attracts the masses. Her habitual muteness and the gentle hesitancy of those rare words that do fall from her lips make her seem bashful, as does her manner of ducking her head and looking up through sweeping lashes. Apart from her collection of baubles and kennel of favorite dogs, she appears to have no passions or vices, and when she attends royal functions, her gaze drifts to invisible spectacles that only she can apprehend. Her elusive character is a blank parchment, upon which any story may be written, and every girl who dreams of becoming a princess can imagine herself in Princess Aphilda's famously tiny shoes. I know more of the princess's history than anyone else alive, and the true tale is not as fantastical as the one sung by troubadours. Nobody's interested in the story of a flesh-and-blood nobleman's daughter, one who wet her bed, complained of boredom, fought with her kin, and turned up her nose at winter greens just like any mortal child. Nor do I have any desire to diminish the adulation for the princess, which makes both the admiring and the admired so content. I do not set out to write the princess's history, but my own, the only tale I have the authority to tell. My quill may resurrect ghosts to keep me company during the long days at the castle, and if it cannot, at least my mind will be occupied and my hands busy. As for fables about good and evil, and songs about glass slippers, I shall leave those to the minstrels. They can invent their own tales about Cinderella. So that's the prologue, which I think sort of sets up the book in that she's going to tell her story from her perspective. And it really is the story of her life. So it starts from when she's about 10 years old, and we follow her till she's about 50. And I think of it as kind of a nested fairy tale where Agnes has her own rags to rich arc of her life. And then toward the last third or quarter of the book, we get much more of the Cinderella element, and we get sort of Cinderella's story embedded in the longer story of the stepmother's life. So I'll leave it at that, and we can have a chat.
Great. Yeah, I have questions that I wanted to ask Danielle, but then we want to open it up to the group too and have a discussion, and hopefully you guys all have questions for her as well. But I'd love to start with, this is your first piece of fiction. Like everything before has been very factual and interesting and beautiful, but this is fiction. What drove you to this methodology of writing?
Well, I had always wanted to be a novelist my entire life, and I took a very, very long detour through medicine and science and nonfiction, and sort of finally got back to my true love. I think that fiction is one more way in which we can examine our lives and the world that we live in. I think it's a tool that can make us think differently about our everyday lives.
It's so true. And how did you come up then with this particular idea of the retelling of Cinderella from her stepmother's perspective?
So I had a different novel in the back of my mind for a long time. But then I became a stepmother. And I spent a lot of time thinking about being a stepmother because it was something that I struggled with. It's not, you don't grow up thinking, when I grow up, I want to be a stepmom. It just happens to you and you haven't usually thought it through. And I was really surprised at how challenging a relationship that was. And what I realized was that there are a lot of intrinsic difficulties in the relationship. Because for the child, especially if it's due to divorce, so the child already has two loving parents, welcoming another parent into their lives is not something that they're looking to do. You know, they don't want this other stranger coming into their lives and ordering them around and changing their routines and sucking up the attention of one of their parents. You know, it's sort of a net negative if they already feel supported and loved and have everything that they need from their biological parents. And also for the step parent, I realize it's also challenging because I think, you know, we make a lot of assumptions about human relationships. And one of the assumptions we make is that if you're an adult and you enter into a child's life, that you are automatically going to love that child and that child is automatically going to love you back. But it doesn't always work that way. It takes time. You know, it's not like when you have your own child, I think that Mother Nature gives us the gift of this bond when your child is born. But being a step parent is a bit like your kid bringing a friend home, and then all of a sudden you have to be a parent to that friend. And so you don't know that child as well. You don't necessarily have that bond already. And especially if they have resentments or anyway, they don't see you as a net positive in their lives, it can be a really challenging relationship because you have to do all the stuff for the child that you do for your own child. You have to cook and clean and care for them and drive them around. But they don't necessarily, I mean, your own kids probably don't say thank you either, but they don't necessarily love you. Like they don't give you the hugs and kisses and all the stuff that makes it easier to do. And so when I was thinking about that, I thought, I was thinking about how vilified stepmoms are in so many fairy tales. And then I thought, I wonder if those grew out of this intrinsically difficult relationship and that behind these tales are just ordinary, flawed human beings trying to get along and trying to have a relationship. And that's where Agnes was born.
I love Agnes. How did you find the right balance of describing Agnes's perspective from Cinderella? Because there were so many threads throughout the book where you could see the commonality between the fairy tale and Agnes's version of the reality of her tale. How did you find that right balance?
So I really wanted it to feel like a real family, you know, like real people who are struggling with these issues. And so the most challenging thing about the book was trying to thread the needle between making the stepmother legitimately evil, because she couldn't be this wonderful person or there'd be no story there, right? So she had to actually conform to the fairy tale. She had to be a pretty suboptimal parent to Cinderella. But at the same time, I wanted the reader to have developed enough empathy for that character that they could actually see how she got to this place. And so one of the ways in which I tried to do that was, I was inspired by a story that a colleague told me a long time ago. She was telling me about how her child has obsessive compulsive disorder and her husband does as well. And she was saying that it's so difficult for her to parent the child relative to her husband because she doesn't intrinsically understand the ways in which his OCD affects how he absorbs everything around him about the world. So she said, you know, the family goes to the zoo. He steps in a puddle, gets a wet sock, and then he has to go home and change his sock. And she'll try to talk him out of it and say, you know, the whole family's here. Can't we just, you know, go without a shoe and a sock? And her husband will say, oh, a wet sock is intolerable. Of course we have to go home and change your sock, because he just has a much more visceral understanding of how the child is experiencing that wet sock that she, not having OCD herself, couldn't really understand. So this was a story she told me. And I've thought about that a lot as a parent, how you understand some of your children more easily than others because you have traits in common with them. And so I tried to build this relationship where the stepmother's not a horrible person or a good person. Cinderella's not a horrible person or a good person, but they have this disconnect. The way that they are in the world is very different. And the way Cinderella's been brought up is very different from how Agnes has been brought up. And so she really doesn't understand the girl.
In the beginning of the novel, Agnes says, and I love this line, "Compelling fiction often obscures the humble truth." How do you think fairy tales and folklore influence our expectations and experiences in the real world?
I think fairy tales are so appealing because they're really morally unambiguous, just like Marvel movies or, a lot of the stories that we absorb as children. We know who the good guys are. We know who the bad guys are. We know who to root for. And we're going to be happy when the good guy wins. And we really don't care when the bad guy gets blown up or has her eyes pecked out by birds in the case of the stepsisters, or because we know they're bad. And so we don't have to waste a single moment feeling bad for them. We can just clap our hands and say, "Oh, that was a great story." I think that for children, there are things that they can learn from fairy tales about how to be generous, how to be good, how to be loyal and brave, and so on. So there are, I think, some good lessons to be learned from fairy tales. But I also think that our natural tendency, especially in the Western world, to put everything in categories. So this has been a way of thinking that has been very adaptive for Western society. From Greek logic on, it's given us the Enlightenment, given us computers, the ability to put things in category and say, if this, then not that. This person is good, this person is bad. Sort of categories that are exclusive. But those don't apply well to humans. And I think that we have a tendency to want to use that same way of thinking as applies to humans. And it's very satisfying in a fairy tale. But in real life, I think it really can trip us up because, of course, people aren't good or bad. If you say, I'm a good person, it's like, well, good relative to what? Like, who are the bad people I'm comparing myself to? And I think that gets us into these ways of thinking about, people in jail must be bad people because they're in jail. And so therefore we can let ourselves off the hook about sort of caring what happens. And we get into a tizzy when people we think are good people, comedians who made us laugh growing up, who seemed like good people, do terrible things. And then we don't know, like our heads explode because we don't know how to hold that in our head that, wow, this person who I had slotted in the category of good person is now having these behaviors that are bad. And so in this way, the novel really is looking at the backstory. So what if those categories that we put people in really don't exist? And what if they're just people?
Which feels so timely right now, not only in teams we work with, our families, but our society right now and our country right now, where it's so divided, and just having moments of trying to see different perspectives is challenging, but so critical.
Yeah.
It's something that really stuck with me after reading this book. Like, maybe I actually do spend some time with my father talking about politics. Maybe. Like, maybe understanding his backstory is good.
Yeah.
But
taking the time.
And these categories, though, there's the aesthetic part of it too. And Danielle and I, when we have been talking about the book before, it was interesting because we shared an experience of the original Cinderella fairy tale, where when we read this book, Cinderella is so lovely and beautiful and blonde with this teeny tiny little waist. And both Danielle and I, when we were growing up, we're like, well, that's great, but like, we don't have blonde hair, and like, we don't fit that profile of how her figure is drawn. So we both really resonated more with his stepsisters. And I'm just wondering, what do you think that does to people long term when you don't fit the idealized version of the characters like Cinderella, and you resonate with the stepsisters who are seen as more evil and ugly and terrible and all the things you don't want to be?
Yeah, I thought about that a lot writing the book, and I think it's complicated. It messed with my mind a bit when I was a kid, right? Because I was this tall, lanky, dark-haired person. I didn't have like the blonde curls or the tiny feet. And so when I would play games with my friends, so we played make-believe, I'd always have to be one of the boys, I'd have to be a man, I'd have to be the villain often, because I was much more manly. And so I longed to be that delicate little thing. You know, I longed to be that ideal of feminine beauty with the tiny feet and so on. But I also feel in some ways it was actually really good for me not to have grown up feeling that I could be the Cinderella character, because I think it caused me to put all of that aside. I was like, nope, I'm not going to be that pretty feminine little thing, so I may as well just ignore that, all the aspirations, the Cinderella aspirations that I think can be quite harmful for children. You know, this leaning in for the brass ring, the marriage that's going to transform you. You're going to go through this portal and you'll be someone else coming out the other side. I didn't grow up with thinking any of that. And I actually think that turned out to be a good thing. I also think it's really interesting because, of course, you can be beautiful and not conform to society's expectations of what's beautiful. And so with the stepsisters, I played with that a little bit. So one of them is beautiful, but because fairness, fair skin, fair, which means beautiful, also means pale. And that was very much the sort of fetish in the Middle Ages, was to be pale, 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 like as pale as you possibly could be. So one of them is dark-skinned and doesn't, fit that ideal of beauty, even though she's beautiful. But then the other sister is disfigured and does not, even her mother doesn't think she's beautiful. And that's a really hard thing for her in that society, especially in a society where people still believed back then, what was it called? Physiognomy, the science that says that what you look like actually tells of your character. So I can tell by how broad your forehead is or how small your nose is, whether you're a mean person or a smart person. So they actually in the Middle Ages believed this. So it was very hard for them to not conform to that beauty. But the sister who is disfigured, who has no chance of anyone ever thinking she's beautiful, is actually very freed by that. She doesn't give a fig what anyone thinks of her. Like, she's just been sort of released from so much of society's expectations because she just has to put aside this idea that she could ever be that ideal of feminine beauty like her stepsister.
And she becomes such an interesting character. Like, she does so much that gives her this other kind of beauty that she's the one you really root for. Agnes goes through so many challenges through the book, so much upheaval, so much she has to fight for. Yet the title is All the Ever Afters. Where did that title come from?
So it has kind of a double meaning. One of the meanings is that throughout our life, and Agnes is very typical of this, I think that there are these, it's like climbing a mountain where you have these sort of false peaks and you think, oh, if I just get up there, then I'm going to be totally happy. If I just get into this university, if I just get this job that I want, if I just get this spouse, or if only I could become a parent, or, all of these things that you think, okay, when I get to that place, when I win this award, when I get this grant, then I'm going to be happy. And of course, we get to that place, and it is happy. It's not bad, but it's never the ever after. Then life goes on after that, and you're never at the pinnacle. And so I think of life as this series of happily ever afters. So Cinderella gets married, but her life doesn't end there. She's happy she gets to marry the prince, but it goes on. And Agnes's life is this sort of series of events, good and bad, and none of them are ever after until the very end. The other meaning, one of the things I find really fascinating about stories, because I think that we really look at life through a narrative lens, is when a story has a happy ending. Like, if you and I are competing in a spelling bee and you win.
I doubt that would happen, but okay.
But then you get your happily ever after, right? Like, I win. But the story includes me too. And so your story is the happy and mine is the, oh, I'm so sad, because my dreams are crushed. And so that's the other meaning of All the Ever Afters, is it's not just about one person. It's not just about Cinderella. It's about Cinderella's stepmother, her dad, her stepsisters. It's about everybody's ever afters.
I love that. So Ella is described throughout your novel as somewhat of a spoiled child, incredibly different from the idolized Cinderella that we all know. Yet she's far more dimensional and realized. How did you design that character?
So
behind the idol.
So getting back to, I wanted there to be this disconnect between the stepmother and her stepdaughter. And I thought about, what is Cinderella like from the fairy tale that we hear? She's sweet. She's kind. She's very quiet. She's obedient. She always follows the rules. She's maybe friends with animals in the Disney version, actually in the Grimm Brothers version as well. And so I wanted to create a character where she could be like a real, because that doesn't sound like a real, I mean, as a parent, you think, but that's pretty one-dimensional. Like, I can't imagine a child who's only those things. But I thought that people who are not neurotypical often have some of those traits, like, you know, being more rule following and so on. And I'm surrounded by people like that in Palo Alto and in my family. And I just thought, you know, like I could see that disconnect between somebody who grew up in a very rough and tumble world, living with this girl who had many privileges, who sort of hasn't learned the same life lessons, but who also just has a very different way of seeing the world. You know, she's so much quieter. She just isn't, she doesn't have the same, Agnes's daughters are very like physical and so on. And she's much more like, I think she describes her at one point like sun sparkling on the water. You know, it's just, there's something about her that's a bit more dreamy, that's a bit more interior. And so I wanted to make it so that the Cinderella character wouldn't be spoiled. Like I didn't intend for her to come across that way. And I think one of the things that's a real challenge is the story is told in the first person. So you really only get Agnes's view of everybody. And so I had to show that she's feeling disconnected from this child. But I tried to have other characters in the story come in and show how much they love the Cinderella character. You know, how much they think she's this wonderful child, which she is. She's just, you know, from Agnes's perspective, they just have this disconnect. So that was what I was trying to go for, was so that you can understand how Agnes was not the best step parent to her, but you could also see that it's not Cinderella's fault, you know, that other people adore her and think she's the best thing.
But I think she's also described at some point as almost a vessel for anyone that she comes in contact with, because she is maybe less three-dimensional than one might imagine, that people could put their own desires of who she should be upon her.
Yeah, although that was more a commentary on celebrity. So what I was thinking of there is how we admire, they do these gorgeous human beings in Hollywood or elsewhere, or like Princess Diana. When I was a kid, you know, people got up in the middle of the night to watch the royal wedding, and it was such a big deal. And we all got our hair cut like that, and we all wore the little frilly collared
Not me,
shirts.
just a friend.
So we all wanted to dress like her, but we didn't know anything about her. I mean, she was a celebrity. She was an unknown. She was a blank parchment. She was that person that we all had these longings, these sort of inchoate longings that we projected at her or at movie stars. But it's not about who they are as people. It's really about our own desires and our own longings.
So who I loved most in the book is our main character, Agnes. She's so strong. She's so resilient. She fights so hard for what she believes in and for the people that she loves. She says at one point in the book to her two daughters, "Every woman serves a master, be it an overlord or a husband, and she is fortunate if he does not beat her or treat her cruelly. Everything you have, I got for you, either through marriage or hard work. There is no alternative." The men in this novel are often careless and even cruel, while the women show resilience and care. Can you talk about your choice of writing the characters that way?
So I'm not sure there's such a stark line between the men and the women, but certainly Cinderella is a story about women and women's lives. And, you know, throughout the world and over history, women have often been treated much more like possessions than like real people. So I wanted to show, even though the women lived within a very narrow sphere, I wanted to show the full sort of richness of their lives and their characters. But I mean, they're not all great people. In fact, some of the people who torture Agnes the most, there's her boss, the nurse, when she's a kid, who's pretty evil toward her. And then, much of her disappointment comes from the abbess, who she at first admires so much. And so the women are certainly not perfect characters. And I think that the men are a little bit more side characters because it is a story about women. But I think that they're also very, very complicated. And part of why I think we see them as more negative is, again, because we're seeing them through Agnes's eyes. And she has a very complicated relationship with men because she lives in a society where it's impossible for her to have a relationship of equals with a man. It's just not set up that way. And she knows it. And she really resents the fact that they have so much more freedom and so many more entitlements than she has. But at the same time, she needs them, to be able to survive, to be able to get ahead and do what she wants in her life. And so she's got this complex relationship where when she feels any sort of tenderness toward a man, it feels to her a little bit like weakness. And so I don't know if maybe it was hard to pick up in the book, but I was trying to get at, especially with her husband, when she marries Cinderella's father, that he's completely besotted with her. Like, he really loves her, but she can't admit that to herself because it's just too complicated. She needs to hold that at arm's length and sort of stick with, I need to take care of me. I need to take care of my kids. I can't let myself get too soft.
Right.
Yeah.
Women mentoring women is definitely something I think a lot of us think about. It's certainly something that I think about a lot and I've benefited from, and I try to actively make time to help with. It's definitely a theme in the book, both in really beautiful and powerful, positive ways, but also in hurtful, tragic ways. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So Agnes, the stepmother, is born a peasant, and so she, of course, she has no access to education. But she learns to read when she's a servant, when this elderly, very wealthy, very powerful countess, who maybe is somewhat eccentric for the times, she believes in girls' potential, and so she teaches her to read. And it's not a coincidence that the daughter of this countess is the very powerful abbess, who is the very godmother, not magical, but she's the godmother figure in the story. And young Agnes, when she's a teenager, she's really drawn to this very smart and charismatic woman who is one of the most powerful people in a very religious country at the time. And so she wants to follow her. Her heart just goes to this woman, and she decides that she wants to join the church and to sort of follow in her footsteps. But what she can't see, there's a class division, so she doesn't quite understand the way in which being of such low birth means there was never any chance of this. But also, I wanted for the abbess to be a character who has achieved great things, but then kind of pulled up the ladder after herself. When I was in medical school back in the early 90s, there were some of the women doctors I really admired, especially in fields that were very male dominated at the time, like surgery and cardiology, who were really mean. And at the time, we said, my fellow female students and I, that they had to be that way in order to make it in such a tough field at such a tough time. If they hadn't had that sort of personality or that rough exterior, that they would not have been able to make it. And I think that the abbess is one of those sorts of people. But as I've gotten older, I've also felt like, didn't they kind of owe it a little bit to the women who came behind them not to pull up the ladder quite so hard behind them? And I wondered how much being a powerful woman in a male-dominated world makes you feel even better about yourself than if there were a lot of other successful women, because maybe that makes you even more special, that you're the only one, you're the only one who could make it. So anyway, that's this character. She fulfills a bit of that role.
I love that. So good. And it's so true too. There is really a truth in that. I want to open this up. Do folks here have questions for Danielle? I don't want to dominate her completely, although I have plenty more to ask her. But
yes.
Hello, thank you for coming. Interesting discussion. So the question I wanted to ask was around your process. So did you write like on the weekends or in the mornings or evenings, or can you, give us any insights to that?
Sure. So I started working on this book when I was still working full-time as a physician, but then I later quit and became a full-time writer. So at first I was mostly working on airplanes, flying back and forth across the country because I was working in Boston and living in California, which is kind of nuts. And so I read a lot of books about the Middle Ages to try to get some of those details right. And then when I started writing full-time, I really tried to treat it like a job, just like when I had to go into my workplace. So I have the luxury of being able to start later in the morning. I get to go exercise first thing in the morning, and I don't have to, nobody's paying attention to when I actually get onto my computer. But I really try to sort of set aside those hours from sort of mid-morning until time to start making dinner and just work through. And it's not, at least for me, it's not possible to be productive and creative through that entire period. But I try, when I feel like I'm running out of steam, I try to spend time doing other things like research for other projects or for that project, or sort of like reading on background, other ways so that it's still part of my work day. Because I think it's really easy as a writer to just procrastinate and for things to go year after year without getting done.
So the book was set in a medieval setting, so you did quite a bit of research, I'm imagining, for this book. I know you visited castles and hearing about some of your trips. Can you talk a little bit about that part of the process, the research part for this?
Yeah, so mostly I read books in the beginning just about what medieval villages were like, what medieval castles were like, that sort of thing, to get a sense of the life. But a lot of it was on Google and YouTube. It's amazing how much you can find out. There are people who are hobbyists who brew beer in a medieval style. You can actually go on YouTube and watch somebody making medieval beer. And so I learned so much by people who have done this research for their own amusement. So that was a big part of it. And, one of the things I discovered when I was doing the research is that there's not much known about the poor people from the Middle Ages. Mm. So the rich people who could read and write, we have fairly good records, at least of who married who and whose kid was who and all that sort of stuff. But for the illiterate poor, nobody was writing anything about them. And so we actually know very little. What we do know is mostly from having exhumed bones from graveyards and looking at what ages children died and trying to figure out what children died from. And the few tax records that existed at the time tell us a little bit about the villages and so on, like, who had to pay taxes on how many oxen. And that's kind of it, which actually was very comforting to me, because I was really worried about getting historical details wrong. And then I realized, well, even the historians are arguing about what actually happened. So I felt a little more relaxed after that.
Do other folks have questions for Danielle? I have one I was wondering about and thinking about this discussion. So you have children and stepchildren. If they were to write a book with you included, what do you think the title would be?
Of my book about me?
Yeah, written from your children's perspective.
It would be, What's for Dinner? No, I'm serious. I mean, that's how kids are, right? Like, they don't really see their parents as people. They're just like, the story would go like this. Once upon a time, there was this nice lady. She cooked really good food. I love her. The end. That's kind of, I think, and it's as it should be. They've got their own stuff going on.
They do. So what are you working on now?
So right now I'm working on I mentioned I had this novel in the back of my mind for 10 years. Well, so I finally got around to writing that. So it's not historical fiction. It's actually set in 2003, which isn't that historical. And it takes place in Canada, in Toronto. There was a big blackout in the northeast of the United States and a big chunk of Canada in August of 2003. And the inspiration for the story was the poem, The Love Song of Jailford Proof Rock by T.S. Eliot, which is one of my very favorite poems. And if you're not familiar with it, it's narrated by a character who is approaching or in middle age, who has a big decision, a challenging decision to make. And it sounds like it's of a romantic nature, though we never find out exactly what this choice is. But what's so tragic about the poem is that he knows, even before he's made the choice, that he doesn't have the guts to do it. And the reason is that he lives such a comfortable life. He's got this very upper middle class, comfortable life. Like, I've measured out my days with coffee spoons, you know, the women come and go, speaking of Michelangelo, all those lines that talk about the sprinklers on the streets, and it's just this beautiful, comfortable life. And he just cannot smash that all to bits to do this thing that he wishes he might have the courage to do. And so in my story, the proofread character is a woman in her 60s who's planning the birthday party of her mother. And there's the other main character is her daughter-in-law. And we sort of watch their parallel lives, even though they're, 25, 30 years apart in age. They have very similar trajectories of their lives. And they come together at a certain point, and then they take very different paths. So the older woman is the one who didn't have the courage to take a chance. And the younger woman sort of smashes everything apart she leaves her husband for a woman she's fallen in love with at work, and just, creates havoc. And it sort of follows both of them through the blackout, where they each have their sort of separate epiphanies about their choices and, what they've done in the world. And the reason I chose to set it during the blackout is that my brothers were both living in Toronto at the time, and they told me about how amazing it was when all the lights went out, that people actually came out of their houses and onto their stoops, and they talked to their neighbors, and people had barbecues. They had block parties, basically, because that was the only way you could eat, was to grill your food. And so I think in a blackout, it can go very different ways. I mean, there could have been rioting and looting, and it could have been horrible, but it turned out that it was people volunteered to go direct traffic. It was just it really brought the city together. And so I think for the Jail for Proofread character, she's lived her life in fear, and then she sees that humanity does have this goodness. Mm-hmm. And I think that really sort of causes her to realize that maybe the fear she's been living under was misplaced.
Oh, sounds so good. When is it going to come out?
When I get it done.
We'll look forward to that. So unless folks have other thoughts or questions, yes. Oh, yes, I can repeat the question for you. If you were to write about another fairy tale and take on a different perspective, what would that be?
So that's a really great question. I have thought about it. I haven't come up with a great answer. One of my favorite fairy tales is Beauty and the Beast. I really like that Belle has a little more agency than Cinderella. She's really making choices for other people in her life. So I like that fairy tale, but the twist I haven't really come up with. I really like that the original fairy tale, some people think, is based on a man who had hypertrichosis. So he had this very rare genetic disease where he was basically covered in hair. So people with this condition, they can grow hair all over their bodies. And so his face was all covered by hair, and he married this beautiful woman. He was upper class in France and married a beautiful woman. And so I love that story, because what I don't like about Beauty and the Beast is that he turns into a prince. Like, literally, he has to turn into this babe for her to really be like, oh, okay, now I'll marry you. But I really like the idea that he becomes beautiful in her eyes because she falls in love with him. So I've been playing with that. I haven't quite come up with the right sort of take on it, but if I were to do a twist, it would be that he doesn't turn beautiful, that she just sees him as beautiful because she loves him so much.
Yeah, you should write that one too. That sounds good. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
For coming here and sharing. Yes.